So Kent is up first, and he is a New Harmony resident and professor emeritus of Purdue University, having served 45 years on the faculty in Purdue's Department of Horticulture and Landscape Architecture. Kent and his wife Susie retired to New Harmony in 2018, and in 2020, Kent was asked to become the Lenz House Garden manager, a position he continues to hold with the National Society of Colonial Dames in the state of Indiana. The Colonial Dames are the entity that owns the David Lenz House in New Harmony, which Kent will be talking a little bit more about now. So with that, I'm going to take myself off screen and get Kent's presentation shared so that he can begin talking about the garden.
Okay. I have technical assistance here. So now we go. Well, welcome to you all. I'm excited that so many have come out tonight or tuned in tonight. As Claire stated, the National Society of Colonial Dames of America and the state of Indiana own this property that you see on the screen. It's a very small garden compared to economy because of the nature of ownership of real estate here in New Harmony. What happened back in 2001, I got a call at Purdue from Connie Weinsapple. She had received, was applying for a National Park Service grant, a challenged cost share program to research and re-establish an equivalent of an historic garden for the Lenz House. I'm an architect teaching in the landscape architecture program, so I taught the senior urban design studio. And so what we did is we assembled a special class that spanned 2 semesters, the fall and the spring, and brought in landscape architect majors, horticulture, public horticulture majors, and landscape horticulture and design majors within the school there in the College of Agriculture. And it was a team of 9 students, and they came in the fall and did plant documentation as to inventory what was in the garden when they started. And then they also did photo documentation of the garden and began the research process of trying to find information about a typical Harmonist house garden. So that was how it happened. This is looking from the house out to the 2 small structures at the west side of the garden. The one in the center of the photograph is for a barn. We use that for our storage of shovels and rakes and things. And the one to the left is actually a structure housing a large bake oven, which was a typical oven in the Harmonist period because they didn't have stoves in their houses. They came to that bake oven on their assigned time to produce bread and other things. When we left the project, and it was gardened by Connie's husband, Jim Parent, who unfortunately and very prematurely passed. Then the Colonial Dames had gardeners come in to take care of it. You'll see in the foreground here where the 4 squares right off to the lower front of the first square, the garden was never planted there because when we did the installation 20 years ago, there was a quince tree that was growing in the center of that path. And Tish Mumford was a very important colonial dame in New Harmony. And she said, "You're not going to cut down that quince tree." So the time passed along with Trish, she passed. But when we arrived to reinstate the garden, the tree had also died and had been removed. So one of the first things we did was to try to reestablish the soil. and to clear out the overgrowth of some of the plants. The other problem we had right up next to the house, and I'm sorry this is tilted, but all the gardens had brick edging, and over time those bricks had slid undercover. So one of the first things we did was reset the brick edges and then clear out and reset the plants that we wanted to keep in that location. This was a compost pile that was in an originally flower garden located there. So this was another one where we cleared. That's my son Patrick, who's been a great volunteer. When he came on the weekends, we always put him to work. But we reset the brick border and cleaned out the compost pile and reinstated the soil so that we could, and that's our primary annual zinnia flower patch. So there it is, resurrected, as we say. When we went to Harrisburg and when we worked documenting what we could about what herbs, students put together a list of herbs that were typical of the Harmonist period. And this was the layout that was created to get those back into the garden. So you've got some difficult ones to find seeds for: comfrey, costmary, feverfew, horehound. Some of those were very difficult, but we have a local nursery near New Harmony, and when we found the historic seeds, Pat Compton would start them for us in her greenhouse so that we could bring small plants here and not have to try to raise them directly out of the garden. And those little 4 open squares allow us to get in and weed. This is a drawing that the students created in a grant proposal, and it represents the most complex of the gardens, which we tried to put in based on the description of Harmonist garden plan from correspondence of Giles Avery on his visit to Economy, the 3rd community. And he wrote, the houses and the shops were all built on a line of streets on either side. The streets were laid out in parallel squares, 6 houses in a square, and the center of the area thus formed and was devoted to gardens, each house of which has one. And this is also laid out square so that viewing these areas from the observatory on the steeple of the church, they present groups of gardens like a checkerboard, all of which are sown with beets, carrots, onions in a uniform manner, particularly all of the walks being lined with onion sets of 5 inches apart, 5 rows, 5 inches apart. The form of which the beets, the carrots, the lettuce, and the cabbages are sown is really a lesson in economy, and is after the following manner. First, as before, the walk on each side of the square garden is bordered by onions. Second, a row of beets. Third, and within 6 inches of this, a row of lettuce. Then about 6 inches from this, a row of carrots, and then a row of potatoes. And between each hill of potatoes, and once in about 3 feet, each lettuce row, there is planted a cabbage. Thus, it will be seen that by the time the lettuce is grown, the beets have ample space, and by the time the beets are ripe, the carrots have ample space. And then when the early potatoes are ripe, the cabbages will have ample space. In this manner, every inch of the ground is tied up and there's no room for weeds. Ho, ho. Okay, so this is what we attempted in this square, planting the rows. And then you'll see the small cabbages in the lettuce row, and then the carrots and the beets. In the herb garden, we laid it out in squares to follow the plan which I showed you before, so that we could make it get as many in there as we can. We got about 28, and you can see the rare ones at the top and bottom are actually plants that were donated to us. This is that intense garden in progress. I think they must have had a different cabbage plant, because our cabbage plants grew at an incredible rate and choked everything out. Here's the herb garden. We remove the lines once we get the gardens planted. But you can see here how difficult it is to get the beets between the onions and the lettuce and the cabbage and the carrots, and oh my gosh, it became quite a difficult task. We still try to do it, but it really doesn't work as well as described in the article. So you can see how intense it gets. We do leave out a row of beets down the middle so that we can actually get in to try to keep the garden weeded, because we have a proliferation of weeds in New Harmony. There's the backside of the herb garden. Here are two of our volunteers, Ken and Rose, back. Arriving when I called them and said, oh my God, the gravel's here for the walkways. And here they come. They're irreplaceable volunteers, incredible people. So we got all the gravel in between the walk and the raised beds. We were able to take out that never finished garden there at the far end by the door on the far square, and reinstate the brick edging, and then put in the gravel so that it looks, we rake it about every other morning. Tours go through at 1 o'clock. I'm amazed at how many people visit this garden. Every day you can tell that it's been highly walked. Here on the lower left, you can see the structure that we build for the cucumbers to climb, just made out of limbs we take from the forest. Now here it is pretty much in full glory. You can see the pole beans in the back of the fourth square. Everything is in pretty big bloom at this point. And there are the paths. There are the cucumbers. It's really interesting. Children come, they don't realize they hang on that structure, and they can actually go in and touch them and see them and realize how they grow. This last year, we got a grant from a foundation, the Ephraimson Family Foundation of Indianapolis, and they funded a $500 grant to allow us to put in the garden you see here on the right, which extends on the other side of our new fence. It has 2 sour cherry trees in it that were planted the year earlier, but this is a dye garden. We have a wonderful person in town, Peggy Taylor. She has a weaving school here that she's opened, and she asked if we could extend the garden to allow her to plant 7 or 8 of the plants that the Harmonists typically use to dye their fabrics. And so we got that grant and implemented this the small dye garden. The plant you see in the foreground and then down the center is indigo, which creates the beautiful deep blue dye. She uses the marigolds for dye. She uses the tops of the green onions for a beautiful green dye. And last year or the year before, the Colonial Dames of Indiana commissioned her to make a series of scarves for members that use the dyes from the Lenz Garden. Turned out to be a high intense project for poor Peggy. She ended up having to make many scarves than I thought she was going to have to make, but it turned out really well. this past year, Peggy asked again if we would try yet another plant. This is flax, and flax is grown to make linen. And so one of the hard things about it is you have to keep it straight. It has to grow to a height of about 3 feet, and you don't want it falling over. She wants long, straight fibers. So we built this little shelter here. This coming year, we have to move it. It can't be planted in its previous location. So we'll put it on the other end of this garden, and we'll have to put some cross limbs to divide that large 4-foot square into smaller squares, because the wind does affect the plant. It has a beautiful little blue flower when it's at its peak, and it then is harvested, and it's quite a complex process of breaking down the fiber and making linen from it. So we've had lots of comment about it. People had no idea how linen was made. So that's pretty much the story of where we are in the garden. We have had one of the members of the chapter in Indiana leave a bequest to the garden this past year in her will. So we're going to have to figure out how to utilize that to increase the quality of the garden. One of my biggest problems is that the first couple of years, the animals hadn't discovered it. But we are on the edge of the wilderness here. We're not in an urban setting, so we have skunks, raccoons, deer, groundhogs, and it's going to be difficult. If we increase the garden, we're going to be moving towards the woods, which again, we're going to have to worry about securing it a little better, I think. I transported many raccoons to the great state of Illinois this last summer, hoping they never return. So anyway, that is the end of my presentation. Pretty much on time, Claire.
You are. Thank you so much, Kent.
All right.
I'm gonna have you stop sharing your screen. Can you hit the stop share screen at the bottom of your computer?
Am I looking for here?
That little green button at the bottom.
I have nothing showing up.
You don't.
Well, there's a green.
Oh, there we go. Joe's got his screen.
Share screen.
We're good.
You're
Joe's got
good?
his screen.
All right.
All right. So let me introduce Joe. All right. Nope.
Claire's going to introduce Joe.
Sorry, we're having a little bit of technical difficulties here. One moment.
It's my fault.
All right, I'm back. Okay, so Joe has been a volunteer at Old Economy for 12 years. I think this, based on the conversation we were having before the presentation started, I think this might be his 3rd or 4th career at this point. He works in consultation with the Old Economy team to run the gardens at Old Economy Village. So with that, I'm going to kind of pass it over to him.
Thank you very much. I'm very honored to participate tonight. And I want to tell you about George Rapp's garden here at Old Economy. In 1824, when the Harmonists moved from New Harmony, Indiana, east, so they can be close to the population centers of the East Coast, George Rapp purchased 3,100 acres, 18 miles north of the city of Pittsburgh. And at the time, it was known as Dead Man's Ripple. I've always found that a very interesting site. He would take and he would name the new site Economy. And it was based upon the spiritual notation of a city in which God dwelled with men and attained perfection. On the 3,100 acres, Rapp would create a garden which would be his vision of the Garden of Eden as it existed prior to Adam. And so in the garden, there is a lot of religious symbolism. And I'm going to point some of that out as I go along. The garden is divided into quadrants. And the first picture that I'm showing you is the Schloss Ludwigsburg. It is in Württemberg, Germany. And we think that Rapp may have used some of the elements of this garden when he developed his garden at Economy. This is the garden at Hohenheim in Württemberg, Germany. The garden as it appears today, as well as a drawing, and some of these elements may be used. This is what the 3.1 acres look like in George Rapp's garden. At the center is a fountain, a pond, and it is cut into quadrants, line running north and south, east to west. And this, to the Harmonists, was symbolic of the Christian cross. This is a drawing from 1890 by John Duss. John Duss was a conductor of the Harmonist band, as well as later a trustee of Old Economy, and he was one of the final three Harmonists before the society was dissolved. In it, he lists the plants, he shows where they were located, and he shows that center area with the pond and the intersecting lines. In the northwest quadrant of Economy was a grape orchard. And this is the grape orchard as it appears today. And this leads to a mound or a bower, atop of which is a grape arbor. And it is said that Rapp would go into the grape arbor and prepare some of his sermons. These are drawings of grottos as they would appear in Germany. They are round with thatched roofs. So these would be similar to what the grotto appears today at Old Economy. The grotto is stone with a thatched roof, and it is said to have a rough appearance on the outside. In 1829, the inside of the grotto was plastered, and it has a dome ceiling, and there are inscriptions naming each site of the Harmonist: New Harmony, Harmony, PA, and Economy, and the years that they existed. The inside is said to be clean. And to the Harmonists, what this meant was we were all rough on the outside, but yet clean and pure on the inside. Romulus L. Baker, who was at one time a shopkeeper and a postmaster at Old Economy, would bring married strangers, and a stranger would be a non-Harmonist couple, to the grotto, and he would tell the husband, if your wife takes the high tone, you should take the low tone so that you can both live in harmony. The upper left shows a picture of the grotto, and in the background, you can see the pavilion, which I will discuss shortly, as well as a distance shot of the grotto. This is a drawing of the pavilion. We don't know who drew this picture, but it is not accurate, as today's pavilion exists because it has a dome, and today's pavilion has a flat roof. The drawing on the left is a red chalk drawing of Columbia, and this was done by William Rush, who was an early American sculptor. And he would sculpt often in wood. So he had this design, and on the right-hand side is Center Square in Philadelphia. And that is a nymph with a bittern, and you can see the similarities in the two sculptures. And this is the current pavilion at Old Economy Village. It is hexagonal. At the top, those are concrete urns with fruit. Originally, they were wood, and one of the original wood urns is in the archives here at Old Economy. In the center of the pavilion is a statue of Harmony. And this depicts the Sun Woman in the wilderness from the book of Revelations, chapter 12. And I'll just paraphrase it real quick. The Sun Woman was about to give birth. And prior to her giving birth, a red dragon appeared. The purpose for the red dragon appearing was to devour the child when it was born. Well, the child was born, and it was a male child, and it was immediately taken to heaven, where it received the protection of God. The Sun Woman escaped to the wilderness, which in biblical terminology was the desert, and she remained there for 1,260 days. Now, the symbolism is that the child was the Christ child. The woman who remained in the wilderness for 1,260 days was the mother of the child, or Mary, and not all theologians agree on that. And the red dragon was the devil or Satan. The 1,260 days was used by George Rapp to predict the second coming, which he initially predicted to be September 15th of 1829. And he made that prediction 1,260 days previously. It never occurred on that date, as we know, and he likened it to the fact that there was some dissension within the community, and therefore there was a miscalculation. You can see here in this picture the pond that encircles the pavilion, and the water in the pond is symbolic of the water used at Christian baptism. This next picture is some historical pictures of the garden area. You can see the Harmonist standing outside the pavilion and various pictures of the pavilion. In the lower middle center section is one of the winding paths through the garden. And in the lower left, that was a greenhouse that once stood here at Old Economy. It was demolished a number of years ago. The center part was a conservancy, which housed the large trees and plants of the Harmonist. This might be of interest to Mr. Schuette. The gentleman at the top is Ralph Griswold. He was a landscape architect, and the woman in the picture is Margaret Winters, and they were part of the Griswold, Winters, Swain landscape architect team. They came to Old Economy in 1961 and worked until 1964 in doing some architectural design of the current Rapp House Garden. The picture that you see is taken from the tower of the Lutheran Church, which is across the street from Old Economy. That Lutheran church was once the Harmonist church, but when the Harmonists were dissolved, it turned into a separate congregation. You can see the pavilion in the center, and that building behind it, which has the copper-colored roof, was a bandstand. And behind that, you can see the Ohio River. Now, Mr. Griswold had a local reputation for designing Chatham Village and Point State Park in Pittsburgh. He also worked on the design team for the renovating of Central Park in New York. He worked on the Agora Gardens in Greece, and he helped design the Anzio Cemetery in Europe, which is the largest World War II cemetery in Europe. One of the areas we're most proud of here at Old Economy, it's called the Bridle Path. And you can see in this picture a couple being married, the crash leading down the bridle path, the guests sitting on both sides, and it's all being watched over by Harmony. The bridle path is currently under renovation by Ted McCauley, who is a volunteer here at Old Economy and a member of the board. So we plant this every year. We want it to look good and be a significant place for couples to get married. And as I understand it, there may be as many as 12 marriages this year. This is a picture of the garden. It shows some of the produce that we harvested, the peppers, a number of varieties. We don't use the Harmonist method of planting a garden. We do the rows, but there is not the 6-inch and the 5-inch separation between various plants. The garden is being watered there by me, and we try to keep the garden watered. It is a large garden, and so we do what we can to make sure that there is sufficient water in the garden. The next picture is the medicinal and dye garden. This was put in place by the Western Pennsylvania unit of the Herb Society of America. It is currently cared for by Penn State Master Gardeners. In addition to some of the medicinal herbs, we have the herbs that would be used in the culinary arts, rosemary, thyme, basil, oregano, as well as some, as Mr. Schuette had mentioned, some plants that would be used for dyeing. We have madder, we have indigo, and others as well. The next picture is the greenhouse looking from the garden towards the greenhouse. In the foreground there, in the large picture, those are currant, red currant, and white currant bushes. And to the right of the garden, the greenhouse door, is a lilac bush. And visitors are always amazed by this lilac bush. I don't know how long it's been there, but the base is very large. And oftentimes we've got to encourage people that when they see the lilacs blooming, they all would like one. But it's so high that fortunately we don't suffer a great loss of lilacs off the bush. The picture in the upper left is outside of the greenhouse addition, and covering the window are figs. The fig is the first fruit mentioned in Scripture. It is mentioned 57 times in Scripture. And when Adam and Eve were expelled from the Garden of Eden, they realized their nakedness and they covered themselves with the figs leaves. So what you have is the biblical symbolism from Genesis with the figs. In the lower left-hand corner, the tall plant is hops. The Harmonists did brew beer here at Harmony, Old Economy, and they, in addition to wine, they brewed beer, and they also distilled whiskey. However, the Harmonists did not drink whiskey per se. It was used for medicinal purposes. And I want to mention that one of the medicines that the Harmonists did use was called bone set. It was made from the plant. The leaves and the flowers were brewed into a tea. And because it was so bitter, they had to sweeten it. So they sweetened it with honey, and they also added whiskey. And this was used to treat viral inflammations, influenzas, and colds. John Duss, who I mentioned previously, commercialized the economy bone set by balling it and selling it for $1 a bottle. You can still purchase bone set today, but a 16-ounce bottle of bone set elixir would probably run in the neighborhood of $100. This is the interior of the greenhouse. And what we have done is arranged and rearranged the greenhouse because this year we're hoping to open it to visitors, to allow visitors to walk through and to see not only the plants, but demonstrate some of what we do in sowing seed and in propagating plants, as we do in the upper right-hand corner at the very bottom of that picture. That is a sand bed, and we will use that sand bed to propagate figs and grapevines and other plants as well. I believe now we have in there scented geraniums, which we will very shortly pot and put on display here in the greenhouse. This is one of our youngest volunteers, or the youngest volunteer, Harper Tennant, and what she is doing in the greenhouse is she is fertilizing the plants. This is another angle of the greenhouse, and the center table that you see that currently has a couple of watering cans on it, and that large board is being refurbished by Joe Donovic, who is a Penn State master gardener, and that board will eventually be moved out into the grounds, and individuals can come and take their picture either as a man or Harmonist woman. This is a beehive. For a couple of years, it was attempted to establish a colony of bees here at Old Economy. Unfortunately, the first year, the bees fell victim to a parasite, and in another year, the colony just, I guess, went south for the winter because it just disappeared. The colony disappeared. So what we've done is we have brought this hive closer to the garden, and we'll be using it this year for demonstration purposes for our visitors. Of course, there will not be bees in it, which is good for me because I'm allergic to bee stings. This is the Baker House Garden. This is cared for by Warren Kinnear, who has been a long-term volunteer at Old Economy. He maintains this garden by himself, and you can see what an excellent job Warren does. The garden, the Baker House Garden, was probably similar to what the house garden would be for the Baker family. And this last picture is of the mechanics building, and you can see growing on the building is a grapevine arbor. There are grapevine on an arbor. The arbor is in the background. It is those sticks sticking straight up. When the Harmonist was here, they made wine, usually from the Concord grapes. Unfortunately, we no longer make wine, but we do get an overabundance during the grape harvest. I hope that you'll visit Old Economy so that we can take you through the gardens, through the buildings, and give you some demonstration of what actually goes on here at Old Economy. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. What a wonderful presentation. As a reminder, everyone, if you have any questions or comments that you'd like to share, please put them in the chat. We've already had a few questions come in, so I will just get started with those. The first question, I believe, is for Kent. I came in when he was speaking. So Kent, you mentioned that there were 7 plants in the dye garden that were used. Can you share what the other dye plants were besides the indigo and marable?
No, my God, I didn't bring the list. I can't. Mullen was one. I should have brought the list. I find out who it is and I can send them a copy of the list. So,
All right.
I'm sorry.
We will get that to you at some point. I believe that was Judy that asked that question. Joe, I believe this question is for you. Robin asks, how do you get the fig tree to last through the winter?
And what we do is after it's done producing fruit, we will cut the fig tree back to about 6 inches above the ground. And we do nothing else to it. And each year the figs come back, the fig trees come back. Now, I will mention that we plant our fig trees along a stone wall, which separated the garden at Old Economy from the business street of Old Economy. And it is believed that the sun reflecting off the stone wall encourages the figs to grow and produces a plumper fig. And the same is true with the figs that I showed that were by the greenhouse. The sun reflecting off of the greenhouse, it encourages the fig growth.
Interesting. I actually have a question, and this might be for both of you, but Kent was the one that kind of mentioned the pest problem. Has there been any indication of how the Harmonists dealt with any pests? I mean, I'm sure they had the same problems with groundhogs and beetles and that kind of thing.
I'm personally not aware of any.
No, I don't think we found any correspondence that dealt with that. The problem here is that we really are surrounded by woods and the river, and it's hard not to. And we have a few people in the community that actually feed the animals, which attracts them to the neighborhood. So that doesn't help either.
Well, one thing I'll mention about pests here at Old Economy Village is that the Harmonist had a trap to catch mice, but the trap was constructed in such a way that the mice would be taken alive away from the houses here and the buildings here at Old Economy and set loose, probably to return at some point, but they did not kill or in any way injure the mice. It was a trap that was, and we have one in the Baker house that we show to people, visitors, that this is what they use to catch the mice.
Yeah, one of the things I learned how to, once you've trapped a skunk, what do you do? He's in there, so one of the local gardeners for the New Harmony Inn, RJ, came right on the spot, and he said, threw a sheet over the trap, made sure that they had no way to see out, and lifted it up, put it in the back of his truck, took it to Illinois across the river so it couldn't stop. And I said, well, did it ever spray? He said, no, it's too smart. It's going to splash back on them. They're in this little tight container and they're not about to mess with themselves. So they can shoot it out to somebody else, but it would come back to them. So I was quite surprised that worked. And it worked very well.
It seems like everything you don't want, you're shipping to Illinois. Is that correct?
Yeah. It's very close, and it's shortest. We used to take them to the state park, but I think if I'd spray painted their tails, I'd recognize them. It's not far enough away. You got to be 20 miles.
We had a comment come in from Sylvia, and she was mentioning that George Rapp frequently visited the monastery of Malbron. And the Malbron gardens were the major influence on his garden designs, including kitchen gardens, medicinal herb gardens, etc. And she was wondering if either one of you have studied the similarities of the monastery gardens with Rapp's garden designs. I know, Joe, you would kind of mention a little bit about that. I don't know if you can answer that question. Yeah,
we believe that Rapp took elements from various gardens when he was preparing his Garden of Eden, Garden of Paradise here at Old Economy. So it wasn't one specific design that he used, but it was a compilation of various designs and elements.
One of the things about New Harmony that's different from Old Economy is we don't have control over all of the elements. The elements are all around town. We do have a labyrinth, which is on the edge of town. We do have drawings of the original garden next to Rapp's house, but it's now a lawn. But there are elements in the community that are not connected as one entity, managed by various groups. So my only responsibility at this point is that garden, even though it appears to be small, it's quite enough to take care of.
Well, on that note, Kent, it's you and a couple other volunteers, but I believe Joe said there's a whole team of volunteers that takes care of the gardens over Old Economy, which are vastly larger, of course, than the David Lenz House Garden. Well, I will just put out a final call for any questions in the chat. I think we've couple comments came in. Someone from Harmony, I guess. So this might be a good connection after this meeting. Someone from Harmony is working on getting a historic garden at the Harmony site and would love to meet with you, Joe, and discuss some things. So maybe Sarah can facilitate that after this program is completed. But it looks like that is it for the questions. Thank you all so much for attending. We will continue this series in the future, and we'll be sure to make sure everyone is aware of our next program. Thanks again to Kent and Joe. As a reminder, this was recorded and will be on YouTube hopefully in the next week or two. So that if anyone wants to share or rewatch it, you'll be able to do so then. But otherwise, everyone have a great evening, and we'll see you again next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.